1800s, Kingman, Arizona. The Wild West was an unforgiving place, full of lawlessness, unrelenting heat, and the pursuit of a fortune. Gold was a precious commodity, and numerous settlers braved the harshness of the land to try and find it. Some were lucky, most were not. Out of these stories of the Wild West and desert of Arizona comes the origin of a ghost story, a truly frightening urban legend. But is it just that? What started this urban legend in the seemingly dry and arid canyon? Is there any validity to the legend of what took place in this canyon? And are there connections with a similar ghost story told in Mexico and in another part of Arizona? Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we strap on our ghost hunting equipment and go looking for the ghosts of Slaughterhouse Canyon. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and I want to welcome you back into this week's episode. So if you folks had taken a listen to last week's episode where I said that I did a poll on my Instagram about certain topics to cover in the weeks following, obviously Internet Mystery won that poll, but paranormal came in a very close second. So that is what motivated me to shift gears back into the paranormal realm for this week and for this episode in particular. Now, last week's episode, if you haven't had a chance to listen to it, I highly suggest you do so. It was a super fun episode and also super disturbing if you're kind of into that, if you're kind of into this paranormal stuff, kind of the weird, disturbing kind of stuff. Definitely check that one out as well. It might be up your alley, it might not be, but I'm obviously going to let you know just to definitely go check it out. However, today's topic that I picked out is that being the legend and sort of, I wouldn't say myth because I don't think it's a myth, but kind of the legend and the story of Slaughterhouse Canyon and the ghosts that haunt this canyon. Now, with a name like Slaughterhouse Canyon, you might be wondering that it should be haunted, and that should be a given with a name like that, and I'm going to have to agree with you there. So how today's episode is going to work is that I'm going to dive into the legend and ghost stories surrounding Slaughterhouse Canyon, and then after that go into some other similar ghost stories that bear a lot of similarities to this one, and at the end I'm going to wrap it all up, discuss some theories, and the possibility if maybe these cases are all connected in some way. But with that being said, let's get into the legend and folklore of Slaughterhouse Canyon. Now, our story really begins with the gold rush, and really the prospect of striking it rich. Now, many families that moved out west in the 1800s, this is exactly what they were looking for, and for a majority of them, this would be no easy feat. And to strike it rich and come across some sort of mass treasure trove of wealth was extremely challenging. Not only because gold was extremely rare to come by, but the West was a harsh place for these settlers to adapt to. Food and water were precious commodities, and many families failed to adapt to the conditions, leaving families dying of starvation. Those who survived found new ways to profit through the mining of silver and copper deposits in the Southwest. Now, some of them were able to turn out a nice profit on these silver and copper deposits, and this is what kept their families afloat, but this was kind of far and in between, as the idea of gold kind of faded from people's memory as it was just so much harder to find. Obviously, like I mentioned, people slowly adapted to mining silver and copper. But also, like I mentioned, a lot of people went out there, didn't find anything, and either ended up dying or losing everything that they had because everybody was infatuated with the idea of being rich. Now, where the legend of Slaughterhouse Canyon originates from, I couldn't find a direct answer on. So if there's anybody else out there who is kind of into all this paranormal stuff and you've done some research on this as well, feel free to reach out to me, whether that be in comments, Instagram direct message, my email that I'll give at the end of the episode. If you have found a direct, basically, origination of the legend, because I couldn't personally find it. But from what I could find when searching around online is that it seems that this place is widely regarded to be haunted, and that seems pretty much like a given from what everybody says online. And the stories in the legend of the canyon seem to all be the same, which makes me kind of somewhat confident that we are dealing with one story that created the legend and not kind of multiple stories that conflicted with each other and kind of got all twisted together and kind of mashed. I feel like we often see that sometimes with ghost stories or urban legends, that you have 5 different accounts of the same incident and they all kind of get jumbled up together, and it's hard to discern what the legend truly was in its first form. So kind of knowing that the legend of Slaughterhouse Canyon kind of is like one story kind of makes me feel better that there's probably some validity to the legend of Slaughterhouse Canyon. Now, as the legend goes, one time during the 1800s, a miner and his family moved to the canyon in hopes of raising their family and trying to strike it rich, and they ended up settling in a wood shack in the middle of the canyon. Now, this canyon at the time was unnamed, but it would later go on to be called Luana's Canyon, and this would be because it would be named after the wife of the family who would move there, and this is what it would be called amongst the other settlers in the area, as this family just happened to be the first ones to settle there, so I guess they kind of got the naming rights to the canyon, I'm assuming. In an effort to provide for Luana and their children, the miner, aka the husband, would leave the home and be gone for days, if not weeks at a time, with an effort to return with gold, food, other resources, and valuables so the family could, not be hungry, they would not be dehydrated, that they would have goods that they could trade with other people so they can basically survive. Now, it was expected that no matter how long her husband would be gone for, that Luana's husband would return. Luana just kind of always thought this. He could be gone for a given amount of time, but he always comes back. There's no reason to be worried. Now, however, on one fateful day, that wouldn't happen. The miner wouldn't come home. And as days turned into weeks, and the miner didn't come back home, Luana would grow more and more concerned, wondering what could have possibly happened to her husband. Given the unpredictable nature of the Wild West, anything could have been at play here. Maybe murder, maybe some sort of wild animal attack, or maybe even he succumbed to some type of disease. These all could have been possible. And because of the husband not coming home, Luana and her children would then slowly start to dwindle on the supplies and the food that they had. Now, Luana didn't anticipate her husband's sudden disappearance and did not make an attempt to ration what they had left for food because the husband always came home. There wasn't a need to. If she knew her husband was never coming back, maybe she would have rationed on food, but she had no reason to think that. Now, this meant that the family eventually ran out of food, and starvation began to set in. With the family living in the middle of the canyon and venturing out of it would leave her children alone, this left Luana with very little in terms of options. Now, as food ran out, the children would cry and call out for Luana to help them and find them something to eat when there was, in fact, nothing to eat. The legend continues that the children's cries for help traveled through the winds of the canyon and could be heard all around in the area. Now, the constant sobbing of her children began to take an adverse effect on Luana, and her mental health ended up rapidly declining. Now, this caused Luana to enter some sort of psychosis, and eventually she couldn't bear the sounds of her children weeping and calling out for help, and she snapped. Now, you can probably assume where this story is going to take a dark and grim turn, and it is going to take that turn right now. During a late-night thunderstorm is when Luana would go on to commit an immense act of evil. Now, in her kind of anguished psychosis, kind of dwindled mental state, Luana would go on to put on her wedding dress and proceeded to grab a knife and murder both her children. She would dismember them and carry their bodies down to the river, where she would throw the pieces of them in it. Luana would cry in agony, knowing what she had did was wrong, but it was too late. She had already descended into madness, and she had already committed this evil deed. Luana at this point was pretty much starved to death, and when the night became morning, she would pass away next to the river. Now, the nickname Slaughterhouse Canyon would come from the appearance of the wood shack the family lived in, after the murders would take place, as it would liken its appearance to that of a slaughterhouse. To this day, many people who frequent the canyon still say that you can hear the anguished cries from both children, and the screams from Luana can be heard as well. People have also reported seeing a woman-like apparition in a white dress, seemingly backing up the existence of this legend of a woman brought to insanity. Now, it seems like it is common knowledge to the locals about the ghosts that are in the canyon, but when I tried doing some research, I was hard-pressed to find some photographic evidence of anything paranormal. However, I did find a YouTube video from 2012 of a couple amateur paranormal investigators that went to the canyon, and the video is about 10 minutes long, give or take, and it is titled GHB Slaughterhouse Canyon. And again, it's amateur, so it's not a professional production by any means. It's not like what you see on TV with ghost hunters and all that. It is quite the opposite of that. However, they do get a couple interesting bits of information and kind of evidence, and I was actually like, hey, this is not, for a couple amateur people kind of getting together and doing this, it actually is not that bad. So I definitely suggest checking that out as well. I will provide a link to it on my Instagram when this episode comes out. I will post all photos and information that I found in regards to this episode on my Instagram when it does come out. Now, on the surface, the whole story of Slaughterhouse Canyon could just be a creepy and disturbing story that was spread around the West during this time, meant to, frighten people, or maybe it's something you told around the campfire, just to get, everybody's heart racing a little bit. But other legends exist in different areas of the United States that bear a lot of similarities to this one. And in this episode, I felt like it was important to share those as well. And that even though they are separate legends and may be kind of disconnected, I felt like there was a lot of similarities between the two, and I felt like it was still important to discuss them with you. Now, possibly the most infamous of these kind of Wild West ghost stories, and most importantly, that involve the ghost of a weeping woman, kind of like what takes place in Slaughterhouse Canyon, this ghost story would be the one of La Llorona. Now, you might have heard that before. Anybody who has done any information on the paranormal has probably heard the name La Llorona before. And the legend of La Llorona starts through the telling of the story among Spanish conquistadors, and the legend slowly spread from them to the Hispanic population of the Southwest through the years after. Now, the origin of the legend of La Llorona remains foggy, but I'm going to share with you the portion of the legend we do know. Now, one version of the legend starts with a woman by the name of Maria, who was born into a peasant family in a small village. Now, Maria was very beautiful, and she attracted the attention of many men who lived in the village, whether they were rich or poor. Because of this, Maria would spend many nights out and about flirting with the men of the local town. However, Maria had 2 children, and this made things very difficult. One night, out and about in the town, she had left her children home alone. When she returned, she happened to find both of her children not home, but rather instead drowned in the nearby river. Now, what caused this is unknown. However, Maria took this very harshly amongst herself, as it would be reasonable to assume that she couldn't live with the guilt she had by leaving them all alone that night. After all, because she left them alone, you could say that that's probably the reason why they drowned in the river. Now, this version of the legend does sound very similar to that of the legend we get in Slaughterhouse Canyon, but we will touch on that a little bit later. Now, another version of the La Llorona legend has Maria marrying a wealthy man and having 2 children with him. Now, originally, this wealthy man was a husband who would spoil and treat Maria right, and, this would kind of change his perspective. This husband, this wealthy man that Maria married, was known for womanizing. He was known for going out and drinking, maybe getting into, situations that he shouldn't have been getting into. However, the bad thing about this man is that eventually he would go back to his ways of womanizing and drinking after he supposedly left it all behind, and this would make Maria very upset. However, the bad thing about this is that Maria also had 2 children with this man, and she hated that her husband was neglecting her and their children, and he was going back out in the town, womanizing, drinking, and all these other things that he shouldn't have been doing. And her husband would even go on to make remarks towards Maria that he was going to leave her and the kids and marry someone who was wealthy like him, which is a terrible thing to say, quite honestly. Now, this legend continues and states that one night Maria was walking down by the river's edge with her 2 children when her husband pulled up alongside her in a carriage. However, her husband was not alone in the carriage and instead was riding with a beautiful and elegant woman, presumably maybe some type of affair he was having. Now, the husband spoke to his children but made no comment towards Maria and would later drive the carriage off down the road. Now, this blatant, ignorance of Maria kind of sent her into a fit of rage, now knowing that her husband was more than likely having an affair and now seemingly wanted no part in her life. Maria would grab her children. She would pick them up, and she would then throw both of them into the river nearby. Now, that's probably not the way I would react to that certain circumstance. However, this is a legend, so there's that to it as well. However, Maria quickly realized the mistake she just made, and she ran up and down the river trying to find them, but at that point, it was too late. In the days that followed, Maria would roam the riverbanks up and down trying to find anything from her children, as she cried day and night endlessly. Eventually, Maria would starve to death as her obsession of her trying to find her children took precedence over her own needs, and she passed away next to the river. Now, whichever of these 2 versions you latch onto is up to you, and also probably, a geographical thing depending on where you are and what story and what version of the legend you've heard. Now, the legend continues, and the story continues, that the ghost of Maria, now known as La Llorona, aka the Weeping Woman, can be seen up and down the river in Santa Fe, New Mexico. She is reportedly seen all over Texas as well, Mexico, Central America. You have all these different places that have some version of the legend of La Llorona. Now, people say that they can hear her cries and her sobbing, and some versions of the legends have her being responsible for the disappearances of people in the Southwest and Mexico. Now, this legend is ingrained in Mexican and southwestern U.S. folklore, and has also spawned numerous movies as well. Now, even though the legend of La Llorona seems to be disconnected from that of the one that takes place in Slaughterhouse Canyon, what makes me really curious is the similarities in the stories. It always starts with a woman and her children, something presumably happening to the father, and then involves a river, whether that be the kids being thrown into it, or the kids being chopped up into little pieces and then thrown into it. And it kind of makes me wonder if there was a possibility that maybe these legends ever meshed with one another, and maybe the stories got intertwined, and as the story was passed down from generation to generation, some facts and details changed, and it ended up resembling something like the La Llorona legend of the other parts of southwestern Mexico. That being Slaughterhouse Canyon, that is. Now, another interesting thing to note as well is that La Llorona seems to have a lot more actual sightings as compared to that of the ghosts of Slaughterhouse Canyon. However, I am still curious as to where, maybe La Llorona is a more well-known legend. Maybe more people are saying, oh, I saw La Llorona, and it was just kind of misidentification, or maybe it was something else, or who knows. But there seems to be a lot more people that say they see La Llorona versus any of the ghosts in Slaughterhouse Canyon. Now, these legends are very, very similar. And I'm going to touch on that all at the end, because I am going to kind of talk about another ghost sighting that bears a lot of resemblance to this as well. However, in my research into La Llorona and trying to find some sort of sightings or experiences or something like that, I actually was able to find a photo that someone took of what they thought was La Llorona on a road near Laredo, Texas in 2021, and that picture is very, very interesting, and I will be sharing that on my Instagram as well, with other photos relevant to this week's episode. Now, like I just mentioned, there is another story of a female apparition that is also prevalent in the Southwest, and this one being the Wailing Woman that haunts the Transept Trail in the Grand Canyon. Now, this legend is more recent than that of the incident at Slaughterhouse Canyon and La Llorona, with this legend reportedly starting around the 1920s. The Wailing Woman of Transept Trail, this legend, also begins with a woman, her husband, and their child. And it goes like this. During the construction of the Grand Canyon Lodge, a woman moved into the lodge with her husband and their son. One day, the husband and son took off for a hike on the trail that later became known as the Transept Trail, as it was unnamed at the time of this kind of whole story taking place. Now, while on this hike, the husband and son were quickly caught up in some freak bad weather. This caused the trail to become extremely slippery, and unfortunately, the husband and son slipped and lost their footing and fell hundreds of feet below to their deaths. Now, quickly realizing when her husband and son did not return, the woman looked up and down the trail, looking for her husband and son, but quickly realized what had become of them. Now, the woman, stricken by grief, returned to the Grand Canyon Lodge where she would commit suicide. Later on in 1932, when the original Grand Canyon Lodge caught on fire and burned down, onlookers to the flames reported seeing an eerie sight, that being the face of a woman that could be seen in the fire. Now, side note, this could obviously be a case of pareidolia, and if you are unfamiliar with what pareidolia is, that is the kind of, I wouldn't say condition, but it's something your brain naturally does when you are trying to make patterns in objects that don't have patterns. You know, I often say it's the Jesus in the toast. I have to imagine everybody's seen Jesus in the toast. We have talked about pareidolia before. Most recently in the Dark Watchers episode, a couple episodes back, we did a whole kind of chunk about whether or not that could be related to pareidolia as well. However, back to the legend. This kind of adds further mysteriousness to the ghost story with the face in the fire, and hikers who currently frequent the Transept Trail say that most often you can hear her wails and cries in the middle of the night, and those who see an apparition of her say she is often wearing a white dress, a scarf, and carrying blue flowers. Now, she also holds connection to the Grand Canyon Lodge to this day, with a former park ranger saying that there is a specific door within the Grand Canyon Lodge that if left open for an extended period of time, the Wailing Woman will come by and slam it closed. Now, with all these legends being in close proximity of each other, it makes me ask the same question that I have briefly mentioned throughout this episode. Could there be some sort of connection between the three of these legends? And that part I am kind of skeptical on, but I'm open to it. Now, there's a lot of similarities between the three, and it makes me think that maybe the legends of the Wild West helped perpetrate the ghost legends in the area. Kingman, Arizona, and the Grand Canyon are approximately 2.5 hours apart from each other, which is far, but not far enough for me to not think that maybe there was some blending of the legends and origins of the stories. But let's discuss all of that further in our theories section. Now, our first theory is that this might be an easy and clear-cut one, but this being that this is a true ghost story. Now, the fact that I believe the ghosts in Slaughterhouse Canyon are more than likely real, and that mostly hinges on the fact that I'm a big believer in the paranormal and kind of everything that falls underneath that. And I think with the amount of people, when you kind of go and look into the canyon and you start reading people's accounts, even though you can't really find many photographs, you can still find a lot of people talking about it, talking about experiences that they've had. And a lot of them seem the same, and a lot of people say that it's a very kind of spooky place with an aura that you can't really explain, and many people report hearing these strange noises and feeling the presence of something being there when there isn't. However, again, I am hard-pressed to think that maybe legends of the West in general helped spread kind of the mythology of the Wild West from the 1800s into the 1900s and now into the current day. That with all these legends being in very close proximity of each other, there must have been some sort of meshing in the stories, and that could be why we have some of the similarities that we do in these three. Do I think that's a smoking gun, clear-cut thing that they're all connected? No, because I think that there's still enough differences in them to make them their own legends. but they're also extremely similar. So what we're faced with is that how accurate are these myths and legends from the Wild West? Just kind of, is there any truth to them? I think that there is, but I think we also have to take it with a grain of salt. Now, our second theory is that the ghosts of Slaughterhouse Canyon, this is simply a story. And if you were a pessimist in terms of the paranormal, you might go with this one. However, this doesn't explain the numerous people saying to have had encounters and to have heard things that are unexplainable. Albeit, Reddit at times might not be the most reliable source of witnesses and sightings, but if you pull up any Reddit thread talking about the Slaughterhouse Canyon, they are very convinced about the possibility of ghosts, and some comments that I have read tell of high school kids that would frequent the canyon because of the ghosts, and often when they do visit at night, they have paranormal experiences. Now, I think it's a given from this place, in that it's had some sort of spiritual influence behind it. Now, whether or not that be from the legend of Luana and her murdering her kids, or something else entirely, kind of remains to be seen. However, if you like the idea that this is simply a story, I could understand that. You can look at a lot of Wild West legends and mythology and say, oh, you know, these were stories that were told around the campfire to give people a little fright, and I kind of touched on this already. But that's realistic. You know, a lot of American mythology that's what it was. You know, you don't really have many instances of, 20, 30, 40 people saying they saw these things. It's more or less them saying, hey, I saw this. It was cool. And I might dive into a whole bunch of American, kind of like legends and like kind of tall tales, critters, urban legends, all of that stuff. I might dive into a little bit more of that. However, that kind of goes in the queue, and I already have a whole long list of topics, but I'm getting off task here. Now, I feel like those are the only two theories we can go with. However, kind of here's my whole opinion on everything. I think that ghost stories of the Wild West in general are probably all real, because I don't really see a reason why people would lie about something like that. Although, maybe the seriousness of the stories and the stories themselves might be a little fabricated, maybe a little bit far-fetched, and whether or not Luana murdered her children during a storm and cut them into little tiny pieces and threw them in the river was real or not, who cares when you're telling a story around the campfire at the end of the day. And the same thing could go with the Wailing Woman of the Transept Trail and even La Llorona, even though I kind of think La Llorona kind of falls into a different category with it being such a widespread legend. Now, I think the only way we can truly tell if Slaughterhouse Canyon is haunted, or even other parts of the Southwest in general are haunted, it is to see for ourselves and form our own conclusions. In my eyes, it's no secret that ghosts and the paranormal are real. However, it's what separates fact from fiction that makes paranormal cases very interesting for me to research and look into. Now, again, I personally think the ghost at Slaughterhouse Canyon is real. I think the story is very kind of, I shouldn't say fun, but it's very interesting. It's very interesting to look into. Obviously, a lot of people have their insight as to what they think actually occurred there, kind of people saying that they have seen things, heard things. So I genuinely think that there is some sort of paranormal activity there. I don't think that anybody is lying about this, as I think there is way too many people saying, hey, we hear things when we go out there. Hey, a lot of the high schoolers, when they go out there, they also hear things. So I genuinely believe that Slaughterhouse Canyon is haunted. As for the stories of the Wailing Woman of the Transept Trail in the Grand Canyon and then La Llorona, I think La Llorona is, again, falls into a different category in and of itself in terms of legends of the Southwest. I mean, you could even lump in, if you're talking legends of the Southwest and kind of everything that seems to transcend cultures, you could even throw, the Chupacabra in there, which is a cryptid. Not paranormal in any way, but the idea of the Chupacabra, the myth and legend of the Chupacabra, also kind of transcends that area of the Southwest, of Mexico, and even Puerto Rico in the case of the Chupacabra. So the legends of the Southwest and Mexico and Central America are very prevalent. So I think La Llorona itself just falls into a different category. However, again, I'm a big believer in the paranormal. I think that a lot of paranormal instances are real. I think it's all what it comes down to is separating fact from fiction and what actually happened. However, again, that is just my personal opinion. Let me know what your opinion is on the ghosts of Slaughterhouse Canyon. Let me know your opinions on the paranormal in general. Let me know how you feel, whether you are a skeptic, whether you are a believer. Let me know in the comments. I greatly appreciate the interaction. It obviously helps me out with the algorithm gods, and I greatly appreciate it. But with that being said, this is going to conclude this week's episode, and at the end of every episode, I do my obligatory plug time, where I talk about that if you were listening to this on Spotify, please turn on notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. If you're happening to listen to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. Obviously, it helps me out with the algorithm, helps me get out to more people, and I greatly appreciate it. Also, follow me as well. Greatly appreciate it. But with that being said, you can also go on to my Instagram, that is Unblurring the Unknown, where I will be posting the custom cover art for this week's episode, along with images that I found relevant to the topic. You can also send me topic suggestions through Instagram direct message or on my email, that is unblurringtheunknown@gmail.com. Send those topic suggestions in. I do them all the time. I try and shoot them right up in the queue because people want to see them. So if you do happen to have one, please send it my way, and I will throw it in the list. But with that being said, that is going to conclude this week's episode. Again, I appreciate the support. I always appreciate it. I can't say enough. Thank you, thank you, thank you. But with that being said, that is going to do it for this week, and I will see you all on the next one.